What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be dissecting some of my street photographs here in this street photography breakdown part 2. And so in these videos, I hope to give you the information that I wish I had when I first started practicing street photography. I want you to not only come home with understanding of how I form a composition and think about the visual elements of street photography, but I want you to also understand the philosophy and the way in which I engage with the world and the behind the scenes of how the photographs were made as a way for you to then apply some of these ideas to your own practice. And so that's the goal with these videos. Hopefully you'll learn something today. I'm sure you will. And so please, without further ado, stay tuned to the end of the video as we go through 5 of my photographs from traveling the world and making street photographs. And so here in example number 1, we have a barber in Zambia. And so as I arrived as a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia, Africa, in Lusaka, where I was stationed during my training, I was interested in this market nearby, and I went to the market. So chaotic, so overwhelming, so many people, and I noticed this barber right off the bat, and so I was interested in this barber shop. And so one of the things that's really difficult to achieve when you're on the streets in these chaotic markets is to create a photograph that puts order to the chaos, right? And that's our goal ultimately, is to articulate the unknown, to go forward into these spontaneous unknown experiences and then put order within the frames. And so at this particular moment here at the barbershop, as I was interested in this scene, I started to make some photographs. And as I approached this scene, this man randomly came by with that fraction of a second looking back at me as I pressed the shutter, and that gaze and that gesture really does add visual impact and emotional impact to the frame due to the close proximity and the gaze of his eyes looking back at you as the viewer. Secondly, we have on the right hand side of the frame in the background, the man with the gesture holding the head of the man who's getting his hair cut, right? And so this is another element in the frame that adds this depth and this layer to the composition that elevates that simple moment of the gesture to a new height. And then finally, we have the pole in the middle of the frame with the beautiful light and shadow play, crushing the background with those deep shadows and popping color from the shirts in the background. And I believe ultimately a great photograph not only has something emotionally impactful like a gesture, a gaze or something, but there's something about the visual elements, though, of a photograph that you must synthesize within your frames, where I believe that a strong photograph combines both the content and the form in a way that is elegant and easy to read for the viewer's eyes, where by positioning my body as close as physically possible to this subject in the foreground, I broke the frame up very simply with a strong gesture on the left-hand side and a background element on the right-hand side. And by combining these elements of light and shadow play with the strong gesture and eyes and gaze, we now have a photograph that checks those boxes for what I believe to be a strong frame. And so here in example number 2, we have the Zambian boys in my village of Impanta, where I spent about a year in this village. And I got to know the people here very intimately, and I was very playful and didn't take myself so seriously. And I spoke the local language, and I could interact with the boys in a very deep way, and I could actually have conversations with people. And so every day I would spend my time in these marketplaces, as there were so many people here gathered in the evenings as the sun would set. And I found that these locations lend itself really well for street photography. And so go to a market, go where the action is, go where the people are. And so here at this scene, I was photographing these boys as I noticed that there was such potential to make a photograph here, as their shirts were matching in color, the background was elegant and beautiful, the light was there, and then all I needed to do was be present. And so I worked this scene and I made lots of frames. And so one of the things that I noticed was the gaze of the boys and the way that they would interact with each other, looking back at each other in the scene. And so I was interested in this boy in the foreground, and as he was looking back at me, I noticed his eyes, and I was trying to make a frame that elevates that mundane gesture to a new height. And so my decision was to essentially crop out his mouth and to only reveal his eyes looking back at me. And so by doing that, we add this visual and emotional impact in the frame that adds a little bit more mystery and intrigue for the viewer. Secondly, we have the middle ground of the frame of the 2 boys who fill the left and right hand side. And the way in which their eyes carry you throughout the frame is actually very visually interesting, as the boy on the left hand side looks back at the boy in the middle. And then the boy in the middle looks back at you. The boy on the right hand side looks towards the right hand side. And so your eyes are carried very naturally throughout a spiral in this frame due to the way that their gazes align. And so these photographs that I'm making a lot of the time have everything to do with the eyes and the gestures and these very simple triggers that draw me me in to make the photo. And so you can see this boy and his eye being revealed behind the pole as he was playing with me, and he was going back and forth, almost hiding from my camera as I was at the scene, working the scene. And he was being really playful because I was being playful and I wasn't taking myself so seriously. And then we have his eye revealing back at you, which adds another element to the frame. The background is very clean, very simple. We have a yellow color on the left-hand side, a cream color on the right-hand side. But the way in which the light and shadow play cast upon this surface also adds another element, another bit of depth to the picture where, not only are the people in my frames a layer, but I also look at light as a layer. And so we have a spiral composition, lots of energy, a very simple, mundane moment elevated to a new height due to the way in which I made these compositional decisions of cropping certain elements of the boy's face in the foreground with his eyes revealed, and then finally that spontaneous moment that occurred of the boy's eye being revealed behind that pole. And so here in example number 3, we have a toy gun in Mumbai. And so here at Dadavi, in the world's largest slum, I was exploring all throughout the streets, and I would find myself going down new alleys and just simply following my curiosity. And so go down that next alley that you see. Go down that random street. Don't be afraid to explore the world, and don't be afraid to go down your own path. And so because I did that, I found this beautiful playground. I had all of these kids running around, and I had this beautiful scene to work with. It came through just me following my intuition. And then when I arrived at this scene, boy, was I pleasantly surprised as all of the children were playing upon this beautiful frame of the slide, and I decided to drop low. And so in order for me to put order in this particular situation, I needed to drop to a low vantage point as my first decision to separate all of the chaos against that blue sky. And so as this child came out of nowhere with this toy gun, he started shooting it, and I was super intrigued by that decisive moment to make a photo of that gesture. And so that was obviously the first compositional decision that I made, was making sure in that fraction of a second to include that within my frame, as that's what would help tell this, story within this scene, is that playful element of the boy with the toy gun. And, it almost looks realistic. And so I decided to very quickly include that in the frame, right? With, quickly making that decision. But I was already at that low vantage point, at that low position when I was making the frame. And so this is how I was able to separate all of the chaos amongst this scene, where we have all of these children and their faces revealed, separated pretty much cleanly against that blue sky, which is very difficult to achieve in these chaotic situations. But once again, you have to be able to articulate the unknown, this chaos, and put order to it. And so a photographer is simply responsible for where they position their physical body in relationship to the moment and the background. And so in this particular moment, I needed to drop low to separate that subject matter of the children playing against the blue sky in order to have a photograph that's easy to read. And then finally, we have these little cherries on top that I like to call. We have this girl with the Band-Aid on the right-hand side with that joyous smile looking back to the right. We have on the bottom left-hand side, underneath the toy gun, this boy, once again, with the mouth cut off and the eyes revealed, looking up at that toy gun, which adds a bit more mystery and almost seriousness to the frame, balancing between the playfulness of the girl with the Band-Aid and the seriousness of the boy's gesture with his eyes. And so those little elements, I believe, are a surprise. We have in the background the blue sky, once again separating our chaotic environment to give our subjects within the frame a stage, a place to sort of have the viewer's eye naturally gravitate, throughout the frame. What I'm trying to say is the background a lot of the time is just as important as the foreground, and so you got to really think about how to put these different pieces together when you're on the streets very quickly and intuitively. And so as I did drop to that low angle, including that toy gun in the frame, we have this chaotic scene that unfolded actually become very orderly in a very spontaneous way, which I find to be the beauty of street photography. It's embracing the chaos and the spontaneity, and then having all of that haphazardness sort of come together naturally through the way that you position your body in relationship to it. And so these kind of moments occur through not only following my curiosity and my courage through going to a new place, but it also derives through your gut instinct to turn left, to turn right, to go to a new place. And then when you're in that new place, embracing the spirit of play, not taking yourself so seriously, and being there and being present when you press the shutter. And sometimes the street photography gods will deliver you the toy gun or the element that adds something more to the frame. And so here in example number 4, we have some Zambian woman. And so during my Peace Corps service, spending a year there in the village, I was working with fish farmers, and I was always out there in the field working alongside farmers. And one of the things that I noticed was how hard working these women were. Every morning at 4 or 5 a.m., they would be banging on the mortar and pestle, preparing food for the day, coming home with babies on their back and firewood on their head. And these women, as they were coming down my road here on this dirt path, I noticed from the corner of my eye, and I decided to step out of my hut. I grabbed some snacks, some water, and I went up to them as they were resting by my place. You know what, actually, I remember is it was mango season, and I would spend a lot of times with my host brother, Bob Walia, and we would climb up the trees, and we would gather buckets and buckets of mangoes. I remember I brought them out mangoes, some water, and we just sat down and chatted, and so I was at the level of this woman in the foreground to make this photograph, once again, dropping to a low angle. But what I want to encourage you to think more about is, how are you interacting with the world? You know, this to me is what's going to reflect back in the photographs you make. And so as a curious person, I went up and engaged with these women, and I had a conversation with them for a good 10, 20 minutes. And I was just genuinely interested in having a chat. You know, one of the things about the Peace Corps that was so beautiful was the way that they integrate you within these communities and the way that they teach you the local language, so that I had the skills to approach these different people to make these photographs. And so once again, to get back to the photography side of things, we have the woman gazing back at you in the foreground, dropping to a low angle to separate her from the background. In the center of the frame, in the middle ground here, we have this woman with this strong gesture, with her arm stretched in a cross, looking back at you. And the beauty of light is that light is out of your control. And what that means is sometimes the spontaneous nature of light will add a visual interesting thing to your frame, right? For instance, her face is covered in shadow, but her body is revealed in the light. And then finally, in the background on the left-hand side, we have a woman who's bending over to pick something up, who is also in the shadow area, adding that third element to the frame that adds visual interest. And so finally, the blue sky we have is covered all throughout the frame, which gives these subjects a beautiful stage to sort of tie together this scene. And then we have the grass elements, the leaves, and the different shrubberies that I included in the foreground that's out of focus, just to help tell the story. But it was also something that just happened naturally through me dropping to a low angle. And so finally, we have the result of this photograph being a tribute to the women of Zambia, who I believe hold the village down. And once again, this is an important thing, right? The goal of a street photographer, the goal of a photographer out there in the world, is to uplift humanity, to champion humanity, and elevate them to a new height. And so I find that the photographs I make reflect that idea, where I want to champion the people within my frames, almost like heroes. And yeah, I think that this photograph definitely does that. Here we have in my final example, number 5, the rooster on Market Street. We have this peculiar man who would walk the street with his rooster here in my hometown, Philadelphia, over and over again throughout the summer. And I decided to chat with him one day. One day, I think it was a week before I made this frame, I took a photo of him with his rooster as he was buying like some sort of Greek food from a street vendor, and then he saw me take a photo of him. We had an interaction, blah, blah, blah. The next week I went back, he was sitting down. And as he was sitting down, I noticed he had some crystals out, some incense going. He had this whole thing going on. And so I decided, you know what, let me crouch down to a low angle, similar to how I interacted with those women at the previous scene that we just looked at. And I just followed my curiosity. I was genuinely interested in this man. I was asking him questions about his day and why does he have a rooster? What is he doing? And I just followed that curiosity. I was just interested in this person. And then because I was curious and interested in this person, I then dropped to a low angle to photograph that rooster. And so, of course, the rooster was of interest to me just as much as the person in the street. However, by including that rooster with the eye looking back at you, it adds a bit of mystery to the frame. Finally, on the left-hand side, we have this beautiful gesture of the man looking up to the right-hand side, which happened at that fraction of a second. These very quick gestures and moments happen really spontaneously, and you got to make sure you follow through and work the scene in order to capture those moments, because they do happen at these fractions of a second. And so by making that photograph of this man's eyes looking up, we have a very mysterious and more impactful image due to that fact, where his pupils aren't necessarily visible and you can see the white of his eyes almost as if he's possessed. But once again, this is something that happens spontaneously. It's not something that I can really control. It's something that you have to respond to through your gut. And then here in the background of the frame, we have this girl who's coming down the sidewalk and her reflection looking back at you in the mirror there in the center. Finally, we have the background elements with the beautiful wall and the leading lines of the sidewalk. And these decisions I made very intuitively and actually decided to include within my frame purposely, where I knew that the photograph would fall flat if I just focused in on the rooster and the man. And so I decided to include that blue sky and that light fixture on the frame of the building on the right-hand side against that blue sky to just add another little visual element, to add a scene, to add a setting for this subject in my frame. And so by dropping to a low angle, following my curiosity and interacting with this person on the streets and returning to the same location over and over again, I was able to essentially come home with this frame. And so this comes through repetition, through practice. Here in my hometown, I visited Market Street every single day for a year straight, and I noticed this man very frequently. And so because he knew me and I knew him, yeah, this photograph was a possibility to make, similar to the way that I interacted at the scenes in Zambia and made those photos. And so hopefully you learned something today. I'm sure that I could talk about these photos more in depth, but I just want to give you a little bit of a brief introduction to how I make photographs, my philosophy behind this whole thing. Because with looking at these frames and maybe breaking them down, you can better understand how you can apply some of these simple philosophies or even the visual elements of how I think about photography compositionally in your practice. That's the goal with these videos, and I hope that something I said in this video can inspire you to go out there and to explore the world. Remember that life is outside of the four corners of the frame, right? Life is outside of your door. Life is outside of the window. You just got to pick up your camera and go. Treat photography as the excuse for you to go out there and to see the world, to see your town, and to go to somewhere new. Take a bus, take a train, walk with your 2 feet, go down a new street. There's so much to see, to do, to explore, and to photograph in this beautiful life of ours. And I think one thing that I really just wanted to wrap this video up with, because I think it's so important, I'll repeat it over and over again, is that photography has nothing to do with photography. Photography has everything to do with how you engage with humanity out there in the open world on the front lines of life. Meaning, you got to go out there and do the thing itself. You got to go out there and experience something, and then that will reflect in the photographs you make. And so allow photography to enrich your everyday life. Allow photography to be the vehicle that guides you out there into the open world to have these enriching experiences. Because over the 10-year journey of me photographing in the streets, I can pretty much 100% tell you that that's where the joy comes from. It's within those enriching experiences and the process itself. And then the photographs are a byproduct of your life experience. And so thanks again for watching today's video. If you want to see more information about street photography, feel free to visit my website at dantesisifo.com. I actually have a free PDF with my contact sheets that you can find where you can learn more about the behind the scenes of my images. I also have a YouTube channel with behind the scenes POV videos from Mumbai. Feel free to check out my playlist, and I will see you in the next video. Peace. Thanks for watching.